Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Yogesh Chavda. I'm the founder of Y2S Consulting and Yogi AI, and the host of Next Frontier Insights. Today, we are coming in early, at least from a Chicago perspective, because our guest lives in Europe. So I wanted to make sure that he was available because it's a very fascinating topic that we're going to talk about today. There's this thing called the say-do gap when you talk about it, things in market research, right? And one of the things that Hakan Yurdakul has done as part of his role at Bolt Insights, as the CEO of Bolt Insights, is that they've been doing some fundamental research recently, which I found to be absolutely fascinating. So he calls it the honesty gap. And I'm very curious to hear from him exactly what we're talking about. And he did it not just in the context of a general thing called the honesty gap or the say do gap, but he's doing it in the context of professional football, not American football, but soccer, right? We in the US we call it soccer, the rest of the world calls it football. So I'm going to keep on calling it football for that reason. So Hakan, thank you so much for coming to the show today.
Thank you so much, Yogesh. One thing we might not have calculated is, in Europe, after 2 p.m. on Fridays, the email traffic drops by 40%. So I hope we have enough people watching us today. So,
well, you know what? People will show up. Don't worry about that, my
friend. Nice. So, hello everyone. I'm Hakan Yurdakul. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Bolt Insight. And thanks a lot, Yogesh, for hosting me today. I hope it's going to be a great conversation on a topic that we really were interested in finding out more about.
Okay, so before we get into the methodology and AI moderated research and all that wonderful stuff, we'll talk about that. Don't worry, we're going to talk about that. You looked at this research that you've done. Obviously, first you need to explain what is the research you did. I would love to get us to a place where we kind of unpack the research itself. What are the insights and why did this become such a big deal for you? So tell us, what did you actually do?
Yeah. So, I can actually start by explaining how this topic came to our minds and how we decided to do research about it. So it was actually, it happened like several months ago. We were in a pub watching football with a good friend and colleague of mine. And we were, looking at the football game. And then at one point, the question came down to, are there any really openly gay players on men's World Cup, football World Cup? And the answer was zero. We searched for it. It was really interesting. And then, what we did? We asked, of course, our best friends these days, one of the LLMs, and asked how many LGBTQ plus members in female World Cup. And can you guess the number, by the way? Just give me a number.
I'm guessing 20%.
It's 13%, but the number was 96 players. Almost 70% of all female teams had at least one LGBTQ plus member.
Wow.
So 0 versus 96. It was really interesting. We thought either, this is one of the most extraordinary run of bad luck in football, or there was something more behind this. So that's where we decided, okay, why don't we run a research about this and try to dig deeper and understand what's going on?
And it's so interesting because sports is one of those industries. I'll call it an industry at the end of the day because it is one where it's highly popular. It's intended to represent all facets of the communities, and yet we have this issue. So I can completely see why you wanted to unpack this a little bit further. So if that's the numbers, tell us culturally what was going on then. Were you able to figure some of that stuff out?
Absolutely. So we looked into some of the numbers out there. There were a lot of interesting data out there online. When you look at how what percentage of the society identifies themselves as LGBTQ plus. Roughly, it's 15%. There are different numbers here and there,
Hmm.
but between
Yeah.
15 to 20% is,
Yeah.
is is the declared number. So if this is for the general population, uh, it feels really weird not to have anyone, openly declaring that
Hmm.
they are part of the
Hmm.
LGBTQ plus community.
Hmm.
So we wanted to understand better. And one of the interesting data that we saw was, it was 92% of people saying a footballer should feel safe to come out.
Hmm.
So this was interesting. Like everybody believes that it's okay to, come out saying, you are part of the LGBTQ plus. But then we had another data which showed only 15% would actually encourage them to come out now.
Huh.
So that was really interesting. You say you're okay, so the world is, you are ready for this news, but
Hmm.
you're saying the world is not, in a way, because you're not encouraging them to do now. And then that was the start of one of the paradoxes in the study. We have
Hmm.
actually uncovered five of those throughout the studies we've done.
Hmm.
Obviously, we use, like, we can talk about it throughout this conversation. Like, we use several different methodologies and try to understand what was really going on. And in
Hmm.
the end, like we said, the title was actually The Honesty Gap. It wasn't actually people were lying, but they were just telling us something else. And we have also identified five different paradoxes behind these numbers, which I'm happy to unpack as we discuss.
Well, listen, you know that one of the things that I love to talk about also is stigma, right? So
Yeah.
this is one of those things where there's clearly some sort of stigmatization happening where people say one thing, but they are very discreet about it, uh, or they don't even want to talk about it. So clearly, there's some sort of cultural phenomenon or something where there seems to be some form of consequence which prevents people from being willing to come out and state exactly who they are. So I'm curious if that's one of the findings that you're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we actually even now presenting this in some of our other studies as well. It's not just say
Hmm.
do gap as we call it. We are
Hmm.
now seeing say do and show gap, which is interesting. Uh,
Okay.
we have for this research we have run quantitative like study surveys like with
Hmm.
1,000 with actually 3,000 people across
Hmm.
US, Brazil, and UK. And then we have also run hundreds of interviews with people, AI moderated interviews. And we also analyzed 90,000 social media posts. And what we have seen is actually different methodologies give us different signs because sometimes what people say, what they think is different. And then what they do is different. But what they also post on social media is also different because then there's the effect of social bias, the fact that they write it for people to see.
Hmm.
It can be significantly different to what they actually do in real life or say to others as well in public or privately. So
Hmm.
we now try to look into in our company, we try to look into this say, do, and show gap. And one of the advantages that Bolt is like we are a multi-methodology company, research firm, which means we can connect the dots instead of trying to bring in different partners and try to understand different perspectives and connect the dots. And
Hmm.
sometimes that results in data lost in translation. We bring that synthesis together, and that was an interesting finding to start with. And then we called it honesty gap because maybe first I should explain the definition of honesty
Yeah.
gap for us. So,
Yeah. Hmm.
honesty gap is the distance between what people say they believe and what they actually feel once the question stops being abstract and becomes more specific, close, and personal. So, and it's not a football specific finding. We have seen that when people are asked a question in a closed end format, they give you an answer. Like in this case, the 92%, say a footballer should feel safe to come out. We have found out that that answer actually doesn't measure what people feel. It measures their awareness of the right answer, because that's what they've been told at, school, media, throughout their social network. They know what the right answer is, and they give you that. But once you dig deeper into their thoughts in a private conversation, in this case with AI moderator, where you remove even the social bias of having a human, the judgment, the human judgment involved. When you remove that from the conversation, they become very candid and they start to explain a lot of other things. And then you see that what we've been measuring was just their awareness of the right answer, but not necessarily what they are internally thinking. And that's what we call the honesty gap. It's not that people are lying, but they are almost programmed to give you an answer. And if you just take that, it can mislead in our judgment of the situation. And this is just about the football, and in this case, the LGBTQ plus community. But imagine applying this thinking across all the innovation tests or discoveries, or finding out pains and gains in consumers' lives. We need to take this into consideration when we, if we want to understand consumers in a better way.
So let's go one step deeper. You said something that was really, really critical, which is that people tend to be politically correct because they've been programmed to say certain things. Like you said, that's 92%. But then once it doesn't feel abstract anymore and becomes personal to them, is that when you start seeing that the truth starts coming out more? Is that what's happening?
Yes, we have seen that as well. When you ask them about, are you okay with a gay player in the World Cup, they say yes. You see that even the scores start to decline when you ask them, are you okay with a gay player in your national team? Score starts to drop. You ask them, are you okay with a coach who identifies as LGBTQ plus that works with your child? The scores drop a bit more. So when you make it personal, ask in a different way and bring it close to the subject, they become affected with the results change. So that's one side, the proximity changing things. But also the fact that, as I said, when they say they're okay with a gay player, they're just giving you one answer. But then if you ask, is it okay for them to come out now, you start to see different results. Or also in the AI moderated interviews, one of the interesting thing was they were saying, I'm okay, but I believe my friends or fans would not be okay. So this was also interesting. I'll actually give you a funny example. In my childhood, my mom was a pharmacist, and I used to work in a pharmacy over the summer vacation. When you stay at the pharmacy, what happens is sometimes some people come into the pharmacy and ask for, sexual health drugs. Yep. And usually they are like, my friend needs it, not me. So it's always the friend. So when you tell people that it's actually others might be thinking different, sometimes it's actually a projection of what you are actually thinking. So in this case, we actually identified that as well. What we've got on the survey was everybody is okay, 92%. But then when you start to have a chat with people, you realize that by saying, others might be different, fans might be reflecting differently, you start to see that it's actually it's their own thoughts rather than the others.
So you come up with like a couple already in terms of the paradoxes that are there. What were the other paradoxes that you were identifying?
Yeah, so one was we called it the paradox of progress, which was the one I talked to you about. The 92% versus the 15%, and then there is the paradox of acceptance. which is about the idealistic versus the lived examples. It was really interesting to see. I'm actually checking my notes so that I'm not giving you some of the wrong stats here. But so 89% are personally comfortable with a player being gay, but 28% believe other fans are comfortable with a gay player. So that there was again a huge gap. And then there was the paradox of acceptance. Um, in this one, it's really interesting where paradox of support, paradox of acceptance, like values versus advice is different. So their values say I'm okay, but then the advice they give to the person is very different. Then the paradox of fandom, what we have seen, the paradox of fame. We have seen that on social media, what people share were completely different. Like there was a lot of negative words, negative lexicon. The sentiments were very negative. And you see that media does that a lot. Although you see rainbow armbands, general support, then whenever somebody comes out, what happens is the news becomes that. It's not anymore your football, your performance, what you do on the pitch, but it's your personal identity. And that was a big issue as well. And then finally, what we have uncovered was actually the one of the also other important ones. We called it paradox of stereotype, the masculine code. That was also interesting. When we dig deeper into the results, what we've seen was that within the context of football, it was all about performance. That masculine codes, like people need to be rough, tough on the pitch. It's all about not necessarily, and it was connected with the male stereotype, and that's why we saw that it was more accepted amongst female players versus male players, because almost all the expectations were associated with being identified as male. That muscles, testosterone, and performance, and that was another issue. So people were associating this with being male, and that's why we have seen that even in the conversations we had about female football, almost all the sentiments were more positive. Oh, it's okay because they need to perform, and it's okay being gay. So they were not considering the players as human beings almost. They were considering them as machines and how they need to perform. So it was all about there were some conversations around the biology, the testosterone levels and all that stuff, and how that might impact their performance on pitch. Which was really interesting to see as well.
Did you see any differences by gender? Like when you did the research, the quant or the qualitative research, did you actually interview males versus females? And were there any differences?
Yes, we actually interviewed male, female, LGBTQ+, so it was all representative. We even interviewed players versus non-players as well. So we wanted to see some semi-professional, even there were some professional footballers in there. So we wanted to see how the results changed across all these findings. And most often what we have seen is in the surveys, we couldn't be able to identify some of these nuances. But when it came to the interviews, we collected a lot of differences, rich feedback from people, because that's also another beauty of AI moderated interviews. Like they know they are being anonymized. So it's actually another interesting thing. We intentionally kept some of the interviews or part of the interviews in text versus video, because that's also another interesting finding, Yogesh. When you do video interviews only, and sometimes that's helpful because you capture some of those, non-verbal feedback, which is very, very helpful. But at the same time, when you do it with video, what happens is you are either speaking to people who are naturally more extroverted, or because they know they are being recorded, they are giving you the answer that either you want to hear or the person that they want to portray. So
Mm,
text helps a lot in bringing those kinds of candid conversations. So with our clients, for example, what we suggest is actually for sensitive topics, definitely it's good to keep um, text in the research because it helps people to give much more candid responses.
mhm,
So that's also another interesting thing. When we talk to people through the AI moderation, and especially with text, we have got a lot of these interesting insights where they candidly share, this is actually my thoughts. Although I said XYZ on the survey, now I'm revealing what I'm thinking. So there's a lot of this interesting findings, which I think, couldn't be able to spot at scale in the past before AI moderation, because people
mhm,
were usually using call as an extra add-on either before or after, but running these things in parallel and asking AI to also help us with finding the correlation points, the
mhm,
differences,
mhm.
commonalities,
Yeah.
now can unlock a lot of other insights that we couldn't be able to spot before.
Okay, so in that context, I totally get, um, there are nuances that you pick up through text versus video and all that. I totally get that. Um, how so in the people that you interviewed, you talked about you interviewed, football players, obviously non-football players, male versus female, non-LGBTQ plus as well as LGBTQ plus. Where were you seeing the biggest gaps in this particular case? Because you were talking about one particular topic. Where did you see the biggest gaps come through? Were there specific communities or groups that were more likely to say one versus
Yeah.
the other?
So it wasn't all sad and dark findings, to be honest. There were some positives as well,
Yeah.
which was like, for example, younger generation
Mm-hmm.
definitely had more acceptance versus the
Mm-hmm.
older generation, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting. I think people are more and more becoming more comfortable with both coming out, identifying themselves as part of the community, or accepting people and friends who are identifying themselves as
Mm-hmm.
part of this community. So I think the future is bright in that sense. Definitely, there are some generational differences.
Mm-hmm.
Also, as I said, between male female respondents, we see that female acceptance is higher versus male. I think that paradox of stereotypes and masculinity is still an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we have definitely seen, and there's a lot of other uh, small nuances across different groups and also country wise. That was also
Mm.
interesting.
I was gonna ask.
Um, we were expecting more differences between countries, but
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, there wasn't much. Like, for example, from a football engagement perspective, US was quite highly engaged with football. At least maybe the magnitude was different versus
Mm-hmm.
Brazil and UK. Like in
Mm-hmm.
terms of people who are regularly on a daily basis following football, yes, it's higher in Brazil and UK. But
Mm-hmm.
in terms of overall engagement, with different magnitudes, it was quite the same across Brazil, UK, and US. That was interesting. And
Mm-hmm.
also, I would expect maybe some differences across developed versus developing countries. We have also now started some research across some other developing countries as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we have seen broadly the similar responses between US and UK and Brazil, quite similar as well, but with some drop in acceptance compared to US and UK.
And which actually doesn't surprise me one bit, right? The the cultural scenario that you have tends to determine that. So right now it seems like globally we're seeing a lot more um, acceptance that's there,
Yeah.
and the fact that we're seeing it actually not happen in the football space just yet, right, actually lends itself to a whole bunch of questions in terms of what should people do? Like, if you are, an owner of a football club, or if you're part of a league, or even if ladder up even to, like, professional levels of like UEFA or FIFA even, right? I they make all the the performative statements about, acceptance and values and things of that nature. We see it all the time, right? But the reality is that there still has to be, not just what they say at the at that level, but it's also what kind of environment they create to make it safe for players to be able to feel comfortable enough to come out and express their identities, right? So is there anything of that nature that you were seeing come through at all from that perspective in terms of the research that you did?
Yeah, we I think the best or closest answer to this comes from more the social media analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So we have looked into the sentiment breakdown across these different countries like Brazil, US, UK. It
Yeah.
was interesting. On a average mean level, pretty much all countries were similar. The
Mm-hmm.
interesting part was, for example, in Brazil,
Yeah.
positive sentiments were significantly higher than US and UK, Yogesh. Although the negative and the negative sentiments were significantly higher than US and UK as well. So it seemed like, for example, Brazil is more polarizing
Mm-hmm.
versus the other countries. But if you looked at just the average, for example, you would have seen that all three countries are quite on the same level. But
Yeah.
then the polarity of the results were quite different.
Amazing. So 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 there's that part, right? We I'm just trying to unpack in terms of, how do we, given the issues that you've identified, people are uncomfortable, people say one thing versus what they do at the end of the day. And you've used football as the example. I totally get that, but this applies to other categories or industries where there's some form of stigmatization that's also happening. So one of the questions that I've always had is, how does a brand or a team in this case overcome that, so that they can either lead for everybody else and change the curve, right? Or in this case, reduce the gap between what people say, what that's politically correct versus what they're actually feeling. Is there anything in the research that's helping you kind of like give you any sense of what people should do?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, the answer comes from some of the qualitative feedback we received from those interviews.
Yeah.
Um, First of all, like one professional footballer actually said, the stadium acts as an amplifier of behavior. The supporters would feel
Hmm.
protected
Hmm.
um, by the crowd and loses moral restraints. This was interesting. So
Hmm.
it is, although like individually people say something, when they're in a group,
Hmm.
they feel more protective and lose their kind of moral restraints. But also, one interesting recommendation was, one person said it actually doesn't need to be the big news; it needs to
Hmm.
be the boring news, which actually gives us very interesting perspective into how brands should approach this topic. It's
Hmm.
not about uh, creating campaigns just for the LGBTQ plus community or wearing rainbow armbands. It needs to
Hmm.
be the boring news. It needs to be part of all the advertising you create. You
Hmm.
need to constantly show gay players performing well. And then it becomes normalized in a way. So
Hmm.
that was a big eye opener, because like initially when people look at these results through surveys, they might think, okay, there is a minority,
Hmm.
we need to support. Let's create an LGBTQ plus campaign. It's
Hmm.
not that actually. It is part of the normal distribution. And it actually, when you make big news out of it, it
Hmm.
creates even further polarization and gets amplified. Rather, it needs to be slowly and silently baked into everything you do. and it needs to become the boring news. That was one of the interesting findings we've had.
Actually, I think it's even, I'll push it even further because you're right. I don't think, campaigns and performative things really makes a difference. You're right. I think it actually helps um, further strengthen the polarization that may be there already, right? But to do this, I'm wondering whether it's actually more of a human-centered design approach, where you design into your activity systems, your community actions that you do as a team, um, how you structure this, the and impact the fan experience inside the stadium during a game. I'm wondering if those are the places where you can really create that that space where people can feel like, okay, there's a safety here for me, and it's okay if I share exactly how who I am and how I feel, and everybody else feels okay with that, because that's the part that I think we have to solve for. And I just don't think campaigns can solve that for you. It has to
Mm,
be almost like a, my words here, a value proposition redesign, you know
absolutely.
that does it, whether it's the LGBTQ community or any other community. I don't know if you've been following the news in the US over the last few days, not in the soccer space, but in the golf space. There was an ad that came out from a brand where they launched a new golf club, and the ad shows this guy runs over and pushes this woman to the ground and says to her, "Don't touch my golf clubs," and he's literally leaning over her, right? And immediately there was a backlash because it just reflected domestic violence,
Yeah.
right? And it's completely now blown up, in the US. The brand is Callaway Golf, and Good Golf, right? That they were the ones who sponsored this, and you've seen the reaction. Retailers have taken away the product from their stores. The relationships have been broken. Everything broke up because of how they completely botched the ad, basically, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it comes down to how do you define the value proposition, and how do you define the space where people all feel like they're part of something and not being excluded from that activity.
Very interesting. No, absolutely. I think there's some sort of hypocrisy involved in all this, to be honest. Like, especially when it comes to the football topic, I think we need to consider almost three different dimensions. Like there is the fans, like
Hmm. Yeah,
there is the clubs, and then there's
yeah,
media. So if you
yeah.
look at fans,
Hmm.
it is believed that fans should judge players only by their performance on the pitch.
Hmm.
Yet there are common mentions of chants, abuse, mockery, online
Hmm.
hostility involved.
Yeah.
Like people are, we had several participants saying, uh, there's online abuse. That's the issue. People around the club might be okay, but social media is brutal. You know, and then when you
Hmm.
look at turn at the clubs,
Hmm.
they offer kind of uncertain depth of support. They are
Hmm.
more reactive than
Hmm.
proactive.
Hmm.
Are they gonna support their players game after game?
Hmm.
Um, the branding is there, but would they really protect the player week after week? That's really important. And then when it comes to media
Yeah.
should be supportive, but they're also known for sensationalism, tokenization and relentless questioning. They
Hmm.
love that news.
Hmm.
So people were saying, the media would make it 10 times bigger than it needs to be.
Yeah.
So how do we protect people and with that kind of approach? So
Hmm.
that's really important. There are really different sides to it, and that's why you know we have heard from people that there is actually no real protection.
Hmm.
People always give you the answer that you want, but in the end, also there's no visible role models existing. That's
Hmm.
also that's also very interesting. Like when we dig deeper into the data, what we have found out was that there was a player in UK
Hmm.
who came out, and it became a huge problem for him. And actually, he committed suicide at the age
Oh,
of 37.
oh my
So
gosh.
these are terrible examples,
Yeah.
and it needs to change. It needs really positive, visible role models. And
Hmm.
when people know this, when footballers in this case know that, it becomes really hard for them to really come out and show their actual personal identities. And it's sad, like people have to hide behind the mask and perform at the same time at the best
Hmm.
level, especially when it comes
Hmm.
to professional footballers. And media and brands have a huge role to
Hmm.
change this.
Do you feel that, and thank you for sharing that because I wasn't aware that that had happened in the UK. But it's again an indication that this is a problem that has to be addressed, right? And to address that, people have to have a roadmap on what steps to take and what outcomes you get as a consequence of that. And I don't think anybody has sat down yet to really figure that part of it out because in some of the research I've been doing around stigma, for example, take cigarettes. It took decades for people to change their opinions on the health aspects of cigarettes, for example, right? And even
Yeah.
then, even after all that, it's still not a situation where everybody accepts it. There are people who still want to smoke, and there are certain cultures where it's still considered to be very acceptable to do that, even though there are significant health concerns that are there. On the flip side, if you think about cannabis, a couple of decades ago, it was considered to be a drug. Today, highly accepted. It just went in the opposite direction. But it took decades for that to happen in both those examples. And I just wonder if there's ways for or for brands or teams in this in your example that can be more proactive and more intentional in terms of destigmatization, so it creates the space for people to be able to be who they are from a professional perspective in the case of football, for example. So obviously you're not asking those questions in your research, but I'm just wondering from an implication perspective if there were insights around that also that you might have been seeing.
Yeah, I think it's about, correcting the norm, Yogesh. I think there's no point of advertising the obvious. Everybody
Mhm.
accepts the obvious. I think
Yeah.
it needs to focus on the gap we talked about. Remember that
Mhm.
90% versus the 28%. It
Yeah.
needs to be about that so that people realize that it's okay to talk about that gap. It's okay
Hmm.
to talk about what people actually think privately. So
Hmm.
we need to make that open. And also, we need to choose the messenger in the right
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
Those club legends, current players. I mean, again, I'm giving these examples from football, but
Hmm.
since it's the topic, but it's
Hmm.
a microcosm, right?
Yeah.
Football is universally accepted, and I think you can apply this to many other things. But
Hmm.
in this case, I think it needs to be some of the club legends accepting so that it feels normal for people to really think differently and be open to share that as well. And then it's
Hmm.
about, removing the friction. So
Hmm.
like what I would suggest is from a sponsorship perspective, it's about, being really proactive and open about, publicly signaling that you
Hmm.
won't drop out LGBTQ plus athletes when they come out,
Hmm.
instead of waiting for that to happen.
Hmm.
You change the agent's calculation. Every player hears that signal, and
Hmm.
from a creative campaign perspective, I think it's not about pride campaign built around courage or
Hmm.
first and visibility. It's about
Hmm.
showing LGBTQ plus athletes competing, winning, losing.
Hmm.
No special ceremony, or it's about normalization. It's the normalization being the creative strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to your point about normalization, I think, you were mentioning the fact that in female soccer, it's already happening. It's
Yeah,
normalized almost,
it is.
right? I'm just curious if it's happening there. There's no reason why it can't happen in the male side of it either. Quite frankly speaking,
Absolutely, absolutely.
right?
There's this, we need to personalize the topic as well. Like there was this
Hmm.
interesting finding we saw, like
Hmm.
nudging people um,
Hmm.
and bringing the topic closer is really working in these kinds of cases. Like there was this study that HMRC did in the
Hmm.
past.
Hmm.
When they sent people a standard letter about people not paying their tax, the impact is just 60% or so.
Hmm.
But when they start to say, you know, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, it increases to
Hmm.
70%. And then
Yeah.
when they say the greater majority in your postcode
Hmm.
are paying their tax on time
Hmm.
and you're not, it
Hmm.
increases to 85%. So
Yeah.
the more personal, closer it gets, the more accepted it becomes. So we need to really, in terms of football, uh, it's not about telling people what the society in general is supposed to think. It's
Hmm.
making it personal.
I understand. I totally get that. So in that vein, I think part of the other challenge that I see is that every brand will say, we have our values, but how do you live those values? That's what it comes down to. So to your point about personalization,
Yeah,
and making it personal, you have to translate the brand or the team's values or the club's values and articulate that and showcase that on a day
yeah,
in and day out basis. And I think this is where when brands fail, they always default to and say, this campaign or this ad did not live up to our values. But no one talks about what were the values in the first place, because if the values were there in the first place, that ad would have never come out at all, like my example from the golf one, right? So
exactly.
I think it's, to your point, to make it personal, you have to take the team or the club's values and make it super personal for everybody: the fans, the players, the coaches, the back office and front office staff. Everybody should be, along with the media too, I would hope, but it's about expressing it and showcasing that in every single space, basically, is what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you also don't need to change what people believe. You need to correct what they believe about each other.
Yeah.
It's also interesting.
Yeah. No, I get that. So listen, I think we've talked about this. I'm just curious, is there anything else that you saw in your research that you wanted to highlight that I didn't ask you?
There is so much in there. So what I would suggest is they should, we can share the email on the chat, but they should email marketing@boltinsight.com to get
Hmm.
access to the report as well and find out about all these things, because there's like 3,000 people surveyed, um, hundreds of people being interviewed, 80,000 posts being analyzed. There's a lot in there. So it's best if they reach out to us and receive the report and read it themselves. I mean, there's only so much that I can share here, but there's
Yeah,
definitely more when you dig deeper into the data.
I think I got the email correct. It's marketing@boltinsight.com. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, perfect. I just dropped it in the chat for everybody to see. So definitely, uh, email at this email address that Harkan shared. I'm definitely going to be reading it for sure. There's definitely stuff here that I'm very curious about. And in fact, with all the work I'm doing on the stigma side of it, I think you've given me access to some information that I would love to be able to quote, if that's okay with you. So.
Absolutely. No, that's the thinking, by the way. What we are planning to do is, instead of,
Mhm.
we attend so many events. Like I think by now in 26 we attended 40 plus events. There's a lot.
Wow.
And the usual one is like we have 300 plus clients, and what I see in these events is usually everybody shows up with a client,
Hmm.
talks about the obvious,
Hmm.
things. They
Hmm.
don't and can't share much as well due to all the confidentiality and everything. And I
Yeah.
feel like you just spend an hour not getting much out of those sessions. And that's why we want to change that a bit. We have that luxury. We have great
Mm.
clients, and we're going to bring in clients to some of these topics. But instead of not sharing anything about confidential projects, we
Yeah.
want to run research that we are
Hmm.
curious about and
Hmm.
share about those things in these events. So there will be more coming up about these topics soon, where we will be uncovering some of these big gaps, like honesty gap. We called it the
Hmm.
knowledge gap, methodology gap. As I
Hmm.
said, say, do, show gap. So we're
Hmm.
going to be covering all these. So I'm probably giving more information than I should, and probably marketing team will shoot me now. But the intention is to make these interesting research thought leadership pieces every quarter.
Well, listen, Akan, I've got two comments to make on that, my friend. First and foremost, I'm glad you're, taking the stance and you're willing to talk about these things. And second, I have topics in this same space that I can also partner with you on to be able to give you some of that ability to showcase, your capabilities to be able to bring out the knowledge that I'm actually looking for to support the work I'm doing right now in the space of Sigma. So even though I also spend time on the AI and marketing and all that stuff, which is my core work right now, my passion for Stigma and this particular topic is extremely high. So maybe someday I'll publish a book. We'll see, but
That's nice.
that's where I'm hoping to go to at some point.
Happy
So
to support however we can. I think we need to make these kinds of things the boring news instead of once in a lifetime type of research that people run. And
fantastic.
that
So
only happens with more focus and more people talking about.
I agree. I agree. So one last question for you before we end the show today. You brought up a few things about like these events and everything. You mentioned that you've attended over 40 plus events this year alone, and you're 100% right. People don't share a lot because they're limited because of confidentiality and so on and so forth. What are the as you reflect on everything that you're observing, what would be those one or two things that you would say to the industry that we need to do this differently, especially because of what you've seen at the events level, but also because of this research that you just did with the football thing, right? So, what advice would you give to the industry from that perspective?
Yeah, so I think with AI, one of the biggest things that is changing in insights professionals' life is I think it's turning us into more, I call it architects than the archaeologists. It used to be, you know, us running different research with different partners in a serial way. You
Hmm.
finish one and then you move on to the other, and then you try to dig into the data and connect the dots. And
Hmm.
everybody creates their own hypotheses. I think AI gives us a really unique advantage in terms of really finding out all those correlation points. And then we can focus as human experts on finding the causation behind that, causality behind that. How do we really become more strategists instead
Hmm.
of data diggers?
Hmm.
It's still helpful, but I think we need to accept that correlation is is an area where AI can be better than us. There, it's really powerful in terms of looking at terabytes of data
Hmm.
and bringing out some correlation points that
Hmm.
humans wouldn't be able to do at that scale.
Hmm.
But what it can't do well is, really bringing that gut feel. And I think that used to be actually something that people advised against in the past. Like I've had, even I'm not going to name them, but I've had managers who said like, stick to the data. It's not about your gut feel. It's about
Yeah.
the data. Now I think it's different. Data is there. Data gives you all the correlation points. It's actually how we can and how brands can differentiate is actually through that gut feel that you bring
Mhm.
into the picture. So it makes us way more strategists in a way, and it gives us also ability to use all these different methodologies to bring different lenses and perspectives in
Mhm.
parallel. You don't have to wait 4 months to run a big quant, qual, and social analysis project. As
Mhm.
in this case, the field for all the study that
Mhm.
I talked to you about, quant, qual, and social, took
Mhm.
less than a week.
Wow.
So, and including the analysis as well. And then, of course, we spent 2 weeks to really dig deeper into identifying the paradoxes and everything. But we spent the time actually thinking about the
Mhm.
results rather than fielding it or
Mhm.
running it operationally. And I think that's a big change in how we do things. Uh, and that way we can actually bring go really deeper into the root cause of things.
Mhm.
Those who know me or have seen me in some of these events, I always give the same example, but again, I'm trying to make it the boring news. But there's this interesting chart which says when you look at the correlation between chocolate consumption and the number of Nobel Prizes won across different countries, what you see is actually a linear graph that shows kind of, the more chocolate you eat, the more Nobel Prizes you can get. And, and and it's not the case actually, right? So and there's a similar one which is also very interesting. Believe it or not, there is a correlation between the stork's population and the number of babies born, uh,
Yeah.
which is also interesting. In some cultures, they believe, they
Mhm.
tell those stories where babies are brought
Yeah.
by stork.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that's just a correlation point. If we just used AI, that could have been what you've been getting from a data perspective. And although these ones are quite obvious and we laugh about it, we fall into these traps a lot
Mm.
on a
Mm.
day-to-day basis when it comes to research. AI tells you one thing, but
Mhm.
when you bring in the human judgment, human intuition, and the gut feel into it, you
Mhm.
start to realize some
Mhm.
other things. And that's why, like, we even relaunched our proposition. We call it Insights at the Speed of Right. While
Mhm.
everybody is, pushing for the speed of light,
Mhm.
at Bolt, we have the research team, we have the brand side, even practitioners,
Mhm.
insights professionals in our business who still, even in your self-serve projects, our team still reviews the AI generated report, adds human
Mhm.
commentary before
Mhm.
it's delivered to you. I think that makes a huge difference.
Amazing, amazing. I love the examples of the correlations between chocolate and Nobel prizes. So don't worry, I'm not going to be eating more chocolate. So that's good. But
Don't worry, it
thank
won't
you.
stop you from getting the Nobel Prize for your book, Yogesh.
There you go. There you go. We'll see. We'll see. Well, listen, Hakan, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I do appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to talk about this topic. I hope it helps um, everyone understand why it's so important to create safety and space for every community to be able to feel comfortable with their identity, to feel comfortable with their um, the way they are contributing and having valuable contributions to the industry that they're in. And in this example, we were talking about sports and soccer in particular. I sincerely hope that we get to a place sooner rather than later where we can see people express who they are, and everybody is accepting and supporting of everybody as a result of that. So you just bringing this information out and sharing that, I think, is just a good way to get these difficult conversations and sensitive conversations for some to come out in the open so we can address these
Absolutely.
issues. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Yogesh, and thank you for this podcast and webinar. I'm really happy to talk about these topics, and thank you for being a great host.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Akan, again. We will be back in a few weeks. I haven't yet announced who's coming next. I'm still working through some of those things, but we will be having, hopefully, the same number of shows that we had for the last couple of years. So, more to come on that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day and have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend, everyone.